Good morning, everyone. I'm Helen Clarkson, CEO of Climate Group, and it's great to be here at Reset Connect Day for today's panel on the UK's energy ambition. This is really an important one given the challenges we face in 2025. For those of us who don't know us, Climate Group is an international NGO. We work with over 600 companies, including some of the biggest in the world, and more than 180 subnational governments who represent around 50% of global GDP. And our mission is to drive climate action fast. And we do that by building these big networks and driving corporate demand for solutions like renewable electricity and electric vehicles. And what we do is take all of that corporate demand and we understand through that where the barriers are to change, and we take that to policymakers and work with policymakers to unlock the policy that will then unlock the investment. And that helps move markets. And in today's geopolitical reality, our corporate members and subnational governments are facing many challenges, as we all are. So tariffs, looming or actual wars, trade, supply chain disruptions. And if we want to speed up the transition, we have to meet those challenges head on. We need to unpack what it takes to accelerate progress while maintaining public trust and long-term impact. And that's what today's panel is all about, addressing the questions around the UK's energy transition in this context of an economic and geopolitical era that's perhaps the most volatile that we've seen for generations. And even though the UK is among the global frontrunners of the transition, one thing is certain, that there's growing pressure to deliver affordable and secure energy to the people and businesses of the UK. And we need that to be clean energy, for reasons of national security, energy independence, competitiveness, and of course to bring down global greenhouse gas emissions and limit global warming. And so the focus for our panel today is how in the UK we're going to do that. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and we've got some of the best placed people in the country to answer those questions. So please join me in welcoming Chris Stark as Head of Mission Control for Clean Power by 2030. He's tasked with delivering the UK's clean power mission. Chris was previously the Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee, where under his leadership the committee recommended a UK net zero target for greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, a target that's now in law. Chris. We'll take a seat. And next we have Carl Trowell, President of UK Strategic Infrastructure at National Grid. Carl has over 25 years of experience in the services, engineering and project management sectors of the energy industry, and broad international experience at CEO level for energy services companies including Valaris and Action Group. Please join us. Thank you. And lastly, we have Angus McCarey, CEO of USwitch. Under Angus's leadership, USwitch is evolving from the UK's most trusted energy switching service to a driving force for mass market energy behaviour change. Angus is focused on unlocking demand flexibility at scale, bringing a consumer-led perspective to today's discussions. Thank you. So in order to kick us off, we're going to hear from Chris about the UK's energy ambition, the government's industrial strategy announced yesterday, and above all, the government's clean power mission as Labour gets to almost 1 year in power. Chris.
Very good morning, everyone. Thank you, Helen, for that very generous introduction. My name's Chris Stark, and I have a wonderful job heading up the government's clean power mission, and I'm going to tell you a bit about that today. But thanks to Reset Connect for this slightly odd vision that we see before us, and for this brilliant panel, of course, today. It's almost a year since I took this job. As Helen said, prior to that I had a different job advising on the UK's transition to net zero at the Climate Change Committee. And I took this job on with some trepidation about 12 months ago when Ed Miliband asked me if I would lead what he described as his tentpole pledge for the new government. And I'm very, very glad I did it. I'm pretty knackered doing it after that first year. It's been quite a year. I want to give you this morning just a very quick take on where we are, where we stand, and where we're going. But let's just start with the bigger picture. We are here in London Climate Action Week. It has been, for all those of us who work on these issues, a tough period. I think we have to admit that. Temperature records continue to be broken. That is not going to change. Extreme weather is becoming the norm. That is not going to change. And amidst all of that, there is this political turbulence around the politics of climate, the politics of net zero. If you read certain newspapers, you might think that we're losing the argument. I want to offer you a correction this morning to some of that and some perspective. I don't think we are. We are here to talk about the UK's energy transition, but let me just start by looking further afield, and I ask you to do the same. If you look beyond Europe, beyond the West, you will see remarkable things are happening around the world on the energy transition. I think we spend too long talking about the petrostates. Something new is emerging, and that's the electrostates that we're seeing around the world. These are the countries, especially in Asia, that are building clean, electrified economies. They're investing in abundant, low-cost electricity production from renewables especially. They're powering their transport with that electricity. They're heating, they're cooling their industries. And they're reducing that, they're doing that to reduce their dependence on global energy markets, fossil fuels. And they're doing it fast. Very fast, much faster, I think, than many of us have noticed. So I start with that because I wanted to make the point that they're not doing it for reasons of virtue. I think they're doing it for reasons of self-interest. It's about their resilience to world affairs. We need to do the same, and we need to keep our eye on what's happening in other parts of the world because the same case applies here. The UK should also want to be one of those electoral states. That is where the world is heading. And the truth is, despite all the noise, that the energy transition globally is accelerating. It's not stalling. And we shouldn't want to miss it. Electrification is the key part of that story. It's, of course, good for the climate, but more important, it's good for the economy. It's good for industries. It's good for jobs. And it is, of course, absolutely essential if we want to reduce our exposure to global fossil fuel shocks, the likes of which that we have seen time and time again in recent years. We saw very clearly, very recently, when our gas prices spiked following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's a live issue again as we follow global events that are happening in the news this week. Here in the UK, electrification matters. About 60 to 70% of the emissions reduction that we need to hit net zero in the UK is going to depend on electrifying the economy and doing that with clean power. That is why we made clean power by 2030 the mission for this government. It is not just about carbon. It is instead about our economic growth. It is about our security. It's about our energy independence in a difficult world. It is the step that unlocks the wider benefits of the energy transition over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And I'm very, very proud to be leading that for this government a year in. So let me tell you how it's going. We have not wasted a single day since July last year. The government was elected to get Britain building again. We're applying that urgency to a clean power system in this country. And you're going to hear from Carl and others in a second. They are our allies in making that happen. We needed first a guide to what to do. We approached our energy system operator, NESO, for that advice. They gave us their analysis of what would be needed for clean power by 2030. And it was very simple. They said we need massive investment in networks, we need massive investment in clean generation, we need new technologies on the system to store that clean power, we need to be able to flexibly produce and consume that clean power in line with a power system that is increasingly dominated by renewables. And they also said we can do it, but only if we turn the taps on all of that as quickly as possible. We didn't water that down. We went all in on it, and we launched our Clean Power Plan just a few months later, and within the first 6 months of taking power. One of the world's most ambitious plans, I think, for the energy transition here in the UK. In that plan, we have national goals now for wind, for solar, for storage, for grid as well, all at the top end of what we think can be achieved over the next 5 years. I'm certain Carl will talk about the scale of that programme from National Grid's perspective. This is big, important stuff for the country. What drives cost is delaying those programmes. We are absolutely ruthlessly focused on making sure that doesn't happen. the kind of secret sauce to making this come together is some genuine radicalism, some real radical reform to the queue of projects waiting to connect to the grid in this country. That queue at present is far, far too long. It has grown tenfold in just the last 5 years. That's what's hampering new generation and storage from joining the grid. That is also what's hampering new demand connections from joining the grid too. We have taken those national goals, turned them into regional goals for onshore wind, for solar, for batteries, for the key technologies that we need for 2030. And we are now using those goals in each part of the country to reorder the queue of projects waiting to connect. That means, come the end of this year, we will have developers across the country who are best placed to deliver the strategic goals that we have for the UK at the front of the queue. By the end of this year, we'll be able to offer new connection agreements to all of the critical projects that we think we will need for 2030 in that 2030 clean power mix. That is genuine radicalism. I'm not aware of any other country in the world that's attacking it with the way that we are going at that right now. It's going to open a flood of clean power projects right across Britain. And that is not all. We set out our stall early. That means we can now measure every single policy step that this government makes, every single change in strategy, every regulatory measure against those clean power goals. We are in the midst of clearing the decks for the big policies that we think will facilitate that shift. So the planning reforms, we are designing them around the need to get clean energy infrastructure into the ground as quickly as possible. Reforms to the contract for difference, which has been such an important policy for this country. We are redesigning that to procure renewable capacity that we need, but also at the best price for the consumer. Wholesale market reforms, which have been a long-running programme that predates this government. You will shortly see the final decision on the REMA programme and that big question of zonal pricing. We have been able to recognise the importance in all of those discussions of securing investment for 2030 and beyond in the power system that we're trying to build. And we've been addressing a host of what you might have previously said were intractable problems, barriers to investment. The onshore wind ban in England, the Ministry of Defence concerns over development of renewables in this country, the environmental, the habitat impacts, which actually we think can sit nicely with the clean power system that we want to build. All of those have been measured against our 2030 goals. All of them have been shaped by the need to deliver the megawatts and the gigawatts of clean power that we need in 2030 and beyond. All of them have the backing of ministers across government, not just in the Energy Department, right up to the Prime Minister himself. That is what makes this a mission, and it is mission thinking in action. I think it's changing the way that we approach the whole of government. Why does that matter? First, because demand is coming. Electricity use as we speak today is relatively flat in the country, but it will surge after 2030. This is not a reckless sprint. We're actually preparing, it's a strategic warm-up for a much bigger race that will happen after 2030, when the power demand in this country might even double on our way to net zero as we decarbonise all those end uses that presently we use fossil fuels. Secondly, it unlocks investment at a scale that is genuinely staggering. If we see the clean power system that we've laid out and those goals achieved, that would be £200 billion of capital investment, private investment, across this country in generation, in grids, in storage, in the key projects. That's a once-in-a-generation programme. It's a major national investment moment to pull that off, and it is a critical part of our infrastructure strategy. And third, because this is our industrial opportunity as well as our energy opportunity, clean power isn't just about infrastructure. It is also about industry, it's about skills, it's about jobs here in the UK. We want Britain to build and benefit from these technologies as we build them. And I think we can lead on some of those technologies globally in Europe and around the world if we move fast to locate the production of those things here in this country. So in the spending review in the last few weeks, in yesterday's industrial strategy, in our infrastructure strategy, you will see that clean power and the energy transition is the big winner. It's great to be able to say that. We have secured genuinely historic funding for the critical industries and the technologies that we need in the face of serious fiscal pressures for this energy transition in this country. because this is a government that is actually committed to seeing this transition through now. And you need to look at the things that we are now supporting: Great British Energy, the port upgrades, the carbon capture and storage that we think we'll need, the clean hydrogen production and storage, the long duration energy storage, new nuclear, supply chain support for wind, huge money going into that now, domestic production of critical components like high voltage cable in this country, really critical industries that we think we can locate and root in this country as we start this transition in earnest. Clean energy is now one of 8 sectors in our industrial strategy, frontier sectors that we say will drive growth and innovation in this country, and I'm very glad to be able to say that. But final point for me, none of this works unless it works for the consumer, for people, and for businesses in this country. Our end goal is very clear. This power system that we are building will have cheap, clean, reliable electricity in abundance for everyone, but we have to get there by investing. And the investment program is what matters, so we have to manage that transition well. Our argument is that we can reach a better consumer outcome while also investing at scale in this power system. Every new wind or solar farm that we bring onto the system is displacing gas. Over time, as renewables start to dominate, we're going to see the wholesale price for power will fall. Gas will not be setting the price 90% of the time as it does now. We'll also see the economic benefits of that investment today, but we'll recover the cost of those investments from consumers over a much longer period, with the permanent reward of lower costs at the end of it, more stability, energy security for households and businesses alike. Reducing electricity prices was deliberately the centrepiece of the industrial strategy yesterday when it was published. We are recognising that lower electricity prices are the very best possible way to encourage clean electricity consumption and, of course, new investment in that electrified future that we want to see. But we are not done yet. Our focus needs to move now to households and, of course, to commercial energy users too. My very final point before we go to the panel, we will not regret this mission. I am sure of it. Britain has already completed the phase out from coal. We've done that successfully ahead of many of our competitors. But this race continues now, and we cannot forget that. The electro states that I talked about are moving incredibly quickly, faster than us, frankly, and we want to lead this next phase of the global energy transition, not follow it. So this is the decade really that will define whether we are successful on that clean power future or not. I think we've got to pick up the pace, and that is my job. We're going to build this infrastructure, we're going to back British industry to support that, we're going to get that clean power flowing. And if we do that, then I would like to see us, I would like to be able to stand before you again to say that we have led the charge on building a new electoral state that can rival those other parts of the world that are doing just that. So thank you, and with that I'll turn to the panel.
Test. You hear me?
Yeah, Chris.
Yeah.
Great. Chris, thank you very much. Loads of ambition there, loads of really exciting things to hear about. Far be it for me to sort of turn negative, I'm not going to straight up, but I'm going to turn to Carl first of all. Can you give us a few thoughts on the topic, and also perhaps lay out what some of the biggest barriers are to this transition?
Yeah, I don't like the idea of it introduces the negative almost. Wholly positive
Only
and wholly
positive
behind
vibes.
Chris's mission. Look, my job is to turn the challenges Chris and government give into a practical delivery. So that means you automatically turn to, okay, what are the barriers we've got to overcome, what are the hurdles? I think, the biggest one is December 2030 is 66 months away. That's the thing that obsesses me, because as part of the mission, we've got in National Grid transmission 86 major projects to deliver in that time, make it work. They're all in flight, but that's a huge task where it takes typically 2/3 of the time to build a new piece of network is in the planning and consenting. And that's the bit where we're really, really spending a lot of time. So there's three things that I think apply to us, but they apply across the whole network, the whole energy system and ecosystem. The first one is planning and consenting, getting the right to build and bringing communities with you when you do that. The second is making sure that we've got the supply chain lined up and we've got the domestic supply chain to deliver that. And then the third one is a bit more technical, but it's access to the system to tap all of this in, because we're going to have to take parts of the network out to be able to connect in new wind farms, the new transmission. So from our perspective, that's the three things that keep us awake. And that the last comment I would make is, we all know it's a massive challenge, CP 2030, but what it has really done is brought enormous focus onto the issue. It's brought the full weight of government behind it, and accordingly, some of the long-standing barriers are now beginning to be tackled. So the new planning and infrastructure bill should deliver some really quite important outcomes. The approach towards getting UK supply chain lined up and getting the whole system joined up to think about how we will deliver this are real advantages of what's happening at the moment.
That's great. And I think that, yes, as you say, Chris talked about the mission approach, that kind of joining up across government. It's not each individual department. Are you already feeling that change?
Yes, definitely. Look, we already, even before the CP 2030 mission was coming, we were working towards a number of 2035 targets. And everything that's come out of CP 2030 has just helped those. Because as Chris said, we don't stop at 2030. It's a sprint to try and achieve some major milestones. But actually, the build-out on the electrification of the economy is going to happen for the next 2 decades or so. And so a lot that's been set up now will set the foundations for what has to come and enable what comes next.
Great. Angus, I'd like to hear your thoughts on what we've heard so far, and especially sort of bringing that consumer perspective. So my first question for you is, how can the energy industry ensure the public feel the benefit of new technologies?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everybody. So Uswitch is obviously one of the most trusted brands in the UK for consumer choices. We have about 30 million people who use our site on any given year, I'd imagine, and hope many of you included in that. And I think let me pick up where, Chris, I think you left off on the consumer agenda of all of this. And we'll talk households, but also businesses, but primarily we think about consumer households. The reality is that Clean Power 2030 as the industry objective is absolutely the right focus for all the reasons Chris laid out. But the average household thinks about this really as affordability. Yeah. And as an industry, we have to manage this balance of those two things together. So delivering Clean Power 2030 for a consumer, bringing consumers in that process, is really about delivering affordable power 2030. And that is because the thing that the consumer cares most about is bringing bills down. And so the way we think about that at Uswitch is to simplify it down to these 4 C's, we call them. So probably unsurprisingly, the first consumer motivation, as we've talked about, is cost. So in the end, consumers in the mass market, not early adopters, a few % of people will make some of these choices for reasons other than cost. But in the mass market, proven time and time again, all sorts of technology changes, consumer adoption, mass market adoption, getting over that chasm is about a value proposition. It's about a money motivation. And so we have to bring all of these pieces together in a way that the public understands that clean power is actually the only structural way to bring down bills for energy in the UK. As far as I'm aware, there is no plan B for that, but that's not the state of general consumer understanding of that today. So that's motivation 1. And then the other 3 C's, just quickly to lay them out. The second one is convenience. We do what is easy and frictionless in our lives. So today, replacing my boiler is massively harder than buying a heat, or easier than buying a heat pump, which is still perceived to be inconvenient and confusing. And smart meters and other things have got a huge role to play in driving higher engagement and increasing convenience. Third one is control. People want to do what they want to do. They don't want to do things that they're told that they have to, and they don't want to feel powerless. And that's our opportunity on the gas transition, because the average UK consumer today feels powerless over bills because of the experience of the last few years, which has made that very real. So although that crisis has been very painful, there's actually a sort of glimmer of hope coming from that in terms of motivation. And then the final one, the 4th C, is conscience. So there is a motivation to do this for something other than pure cost or self-motivation. But in the mass market, it's the lowest of the four. And so we need to be very careful from a consumer point of view that we don't just speak the language of green and clean, because to a mass market consumer, that's not the motivation to do these things. So that's how we think about the consumer side.
Great, thank you. And I wanted to go a bit deeper on this consumer bit. Chris, you mentioned it as well, saying, you sort of alluded to political backlashes. The kind of other side of this argument has a very simple message. They just say, this is really expensive, net zero is expensive, you're done. Whereas what we do is, I read a blog post explaining why renewable energy prices are linked to gas. It took me half an hour, and I think about this all the time, and I couldn't now tell you what the story is, but I understood it via the medium of sort of 10 graphs. How are we going to get, when are we going to get to consumers? I give speeches where like, solar's the cheapest form of energy in history, but that isn't people's lived experience. So let's talk a bit about what's this road to consumers. Angus, you said it's like we have to do more consumer engagement than ever before. How are we going to do that?
Shall I answer?
Well, you start, and then we'll go to Angus. Yeah.
So look, let me first of all just deal with the technical challenge, if you like, which is that in our energy system, we've got a load of investments where we've got to repay the costs of that, basically. So the system that we have at the moment mostly asks the consumer to repay those costs over a long period. So as we make all these investments in our electricity system, we know that the end state is one that we want to reach, because you're going to have a very cheap electricity system at the end of the cycle, because there's no fuel costs with the renewables. The challenge is that we're trying to invest in a load of new infrastructure to facilitate that. So we're moving from an old world where there was a commodity that was being burned that the consumer was largely paying for, so gas, let's call it gas or coal, to a future where there is no commodity. The commodity is free, but you need the consumer to pay for the capital cost of the kit that allows that power to get to where it needs to go. So that's Carl's grids, it's the wind farms, the solar farms, it's also the nuclear power stations. There's a lot of it. So we're talking about hundreds of billions of investment to make that happen. So we have a choice in government, I suppose, as the rule setter here. We can extend or shorten the period over which those costs are recovered from the consumer. So as you would expect, if we're able to lengthen the period over which we recover those costs, that reduces the cost each year. And that makes a lot of sense, given that this is something that will benefit future generations. So that is something that we are thinking about. And the second thing you can do is you potentially can ask the taxpayer rather than the bill payer to pick up some of those costs. And we've also been doing that too. So in the spending review in particular, we've got funding for a whole program which is about cleaning up the way in which we heat homes and making them more energy efficient, which is backed by the taxpayer rather than by the bill payer. So bring those two together, they're your primary levers. The other thing, and this is the real technical thing, is that we have an energy market itself which determines what the electricity, what the cost of that electricity is in the first place. And that is where my focus is primarily. Because at the moment, almost 100% of the time, around 95 to 96 to 97, 98% of the time, it's gas that sets the price in the market because of the way that the wholesale market clears. Basically, the last bit of generation that you bring on to balance supply and demand is often gas, and therefore it has this price-setting role. And as you will have spotted in recent years, the price of gas has been skyrocketing, even though it's come down recently, and it's got nowhere near where we were pre-pandemic. So the price-setting role of gas is something that we can affect by attacking the clean power system. So if we can have different technologies that we bring on, as other countries do, to set the price when you need to, so that might be hydro in some countries, or, really interesting to me, some of these energy storage technologies which basically rival gas and squeeze it off the system. So you turn to those clean sources rather than gas itself. You destroy the periods over which gas is setting the price. We might reach, by the end of 2030, not 100% of the year, but something more like a third of the year where gas is setting the price. It's still a high number. I would like to push that right down to something that's well below 10 if we can. That is a massive challenge, but that's where the benefit to the consumer will come, because the consumer pays at that moment whatever the wholesale price is and how that feeds back into their bill. So my principal thing is that the more that we bring clean sources and clean flexibility and clean storage onto the system, the better the chance that we will remove gas as a market-setting power in the market. And the benefit is, of course, then in the form of emissions. That's the critical thing that we've laid out in our Clean Action Plan. We basically said, look, we've got a gas fleet, we're going to maintain it, but we're going to use it less and less and less, to the point where it is only amounting to about 5% of generation in 2030. So that's the principal way through this, I think, but it's a tough message. So we're also taking, final point for me, in specific areas, the chance to try and reduce the bill where we can. That's what we were doing yesterday, is by focusing on industrial users of power, knowing that they face very high electricity prices and knowing that that is a source of competitive problems for us. We've focused on giving them a special treatment to allow those costs to come down quicker. But we're going to turn our focus now to households and to wider commercial users, and we'll do the same thing again.
Great, thank you. Angus, let's go to your experience with consumers. And as I said, you said that this energy transition requires a higher level of consumer engagement than we've seen before. Can you talk us through how you're going about that?
Yeah, notwithstanding everything Chris said there about the technical remodeling of the system, but if we come all the way to the consumer end of the value chain, then the reason I'd say this energy transition requires a higher level of energy consumer engagement than we've ever seen before, not just before the crisis, but ever, is because consumers need to make, at a minimum, quite a few different decisions. So, I mean, the really basic one is you need to have a smart meter, and we not just have a smart meter, but you need to get value from it. So your smart meter, if you have one, it shouldn't be there for adding up your bill. It should be a vehicle for bringing your bill down, and that's the transition we've got to make. You've probably got to choose a time of use or type of use tariff, or that's got to get bundled because there are going to be good times and bad times to use electricity in that system of the future. And as we've already alluded to, you're going to need to make energy infrastructure investments in your home over time, that transition from the fuel to the capital that Chris described. So that's why we need this level of consumer engagement. And I think in addition to the things Chris described, the only other one I'd say is that in many, many industries, it has been digital technology that has driven the advancement of consumer engagement. And just think about wearables, the impact on your health and well-being of actually having data, not just having a smartwatch or a step tracker, but having the data do something. That's what has to happen here. So an example, I think there's innovation going on all over the industry on these things. An example from us at USwitch is we've built a service, free service for consumers called UTrack. Connect your smart meter to the USwitch app. 500,000 people are using that service now. At the very basic level, unlock the data, put it on your phone, get notifications and alerts, understand your energy bill, but also earn cashback when you move your consumption to different times of the day. And so I think I'm a huge believer that the right kinds of digital engagement can support what the consumer needs to do to get the full benefits of what Chris described.
Thank you. And Carl, let's talk a bit about, you mentioned communities, and how important are communities, consumers, in the grid infrastructure journey that you're on?
Yeah, there's two particular areas. I think we've touched on one, which is the broader one, which is you've got to remember that you're not necessarily talking to the people who are in this room or attend these type of conferences. You've got to take that to the general consumer, the general member of the public. And there, some things resonate and some things don't. Affordability is massively at the top of the list. But what does resonate is security of supply, domestic supply, and then kind of the greening of the energy. And so I think we've got to make sure that we put those forefront. But for us particularly, of course, the big issue is we're asking certain communities in parts of the country to host new infrastructure. And that's something we should take very, very seriously. And that means that as we go through consenting processes, engagement, consultation, we've got to do that in a very careful and empathetic way and make sure that what we're building, we can take communities with us. And that's, a challenge. And it's true for transmission, but it's true for lots of the things that we will need, battery storage, new solar, offshore wind. We've got to fully anticipate that we've got to take local communities with us. And some of that is a hard conversation to have because sometimes people just don't want new infrastructure. And we've got to be able to explain why we're doing it, and we've got to be explaining the trade-offs that we're making when we do it. I mean, for us, we have this very careful balance that we've got to come up with, which is we're tasked, whenever we're asked to develop a new transmission scheme, for example, we've got to look at the cost for the consumer. We've got to look at the reliability and resilience of the system and how you can maintain it. And then we've got to look at the environmental and community impact. And there isn't always a perfect solution to those. But we've got to consider all of them. But at the end of the day, when you do that, overhead lines often come out the best balance to do it. But we've got to explain that.
Great. I want to talk a bit about timescales. I said recently, and I keep thinking about the climate has sort of got a democracy problem, right? That all the things we need to do on climate take incredibly long-term planning. And so you see that the countries, let's name China, where you don't have to worry about changes in administration or changes. How do we think about these things? Think about grid development, network planning's done over decades, regulation takes years. How are you making that work for your supply chain? Chris, how are you thinking about timescales? Let's start with Chris, actually.
Well, I'm not here to try and defeat democracy,
no,
right?
No, quite.
I think it's a really important...
I should say that in the frame of supportive of democracy.
Exactly, yeah. But you're right, we need to take a long-term outlook on infrastructure provision, and it's one of the challenges that in previous iterations, government hasn't always been able to do that. So, slightly oddly, the sprint that we're doing on 2030 is really about the long term, just as Carl said earlier. It is because of a long-term view. So the job I did prior to this, I thought mostly about 2050. So it's that framing that brought me to do this job. Because in 2050, I can tell you that there is certainly a way for us to build all that infrastructure, but you've got to move quickly to get it constructed, because it's not an easy thing to do quickly. And the reason that matters is because, as you say, the decarbonisation of the whole economy, the change in the investment that you see across the whole economy, is not something you can do overnight. And we need essentially the grid to be ready for that. So we are expecting the demand for electricity to grow hugely after 2030. It may grow before 2030. I rather suspect it will be flat, slight increase perhaps by 2030. But I could be wrong on that. But that's going to be driven by the electrification of transport, the electrification of heating and cooling, the electrification of industry. And we're only really at the beginning of that journey. So the point about doing long-term planning is that the short-term focus we brought to clean power is about preparing for that moment. And that therefore means that we've got to send the right signals through policy and through regulation to make sure that Carl is well supported in building that infrastructure that we need. And that is how we achieve the lasting benefit of this, because the regulatory settlement that we have in this country transcends those parliaments. Investment signals that we send today will still be there in 20 years' time for that. So it's very, very important. And one of the reasons why doing a sprint on this matters is because we're essentially laying the foundations for a better outcome over the next 20 years in this parliament. So, future governments will have different views on different things, but we will be building off the fact that we've made these infrastructure decisions today, and I'm very proud to be able to say that.
Thank you. So it's a marathon that starts with a sprint, weirdly. Yeah.
Marathon starts with a sprint. Perfect.
Carl, a bit about the kind of how you think across these different timeframes.
Yeah, very much building on what Chris said. I mean, any new bit of network you want for 2040, we've got to start planning it today. So I think the thing is, in the past, there was a very incremental build out and doing things just when they were needed. Now we're moving to a mode where we're able to start thinking about and planning in anticipation. And a lot of the things that are coming out of government now are helping that. And I think one of the big pushes, if you look beyond this, is there is now a challenge given to the National Energy System Operator to come up with a strategic energy plan and then a centralized network plan. That will start setting the blueprint for beyond 2035, which we need to start now, because we've got to engineer it, we've got to plan it, we've got to consent it. But we've also got to get the supply chain and the skills ready in the UK, and we've got to make the UK attractive to the international supply chain as well. And the further we can go out, the more we can look at a very staged, predictable future, the easier all of that becomes.
Great. Angus, a bit on this for consumers.
Yeah, I think to echo what Chris and Carl have said, I think the most important thing on this, with that long-term vision, is sort of leadership around the pace. And I think huge credit to the amount that has happened in a relatively short period of time. Like, the questions are not new questions, but the amount of intensity and combined focus over the last 18 months, I think is really inspiring to be a part of. And it's about urgency of execution towards those goals. I think the pace is picking up. It's achievable. I think, honestly, we're probably a bit behind where we would need to be now to be certain we were going to get there by 2030. But the point is that that's what leadership is. You have to pick a path, you have to set a time frame, and then you have to try and move things out of your way to get there. I think it's also really important that everybody who works in some way, whether you're on the government side or whether you're in the private sector, it's easy to underestimate how much each constituent part has got to play in that. So this collective feeling in the industry, even the fact that it's quickly abbreviated to CP30, that acronym didn't exist 6 months ago or whatever, is a sign of the power of a true mission, which, Chris, I think is where you started. Like, the mission mindset is a huge part of what will make it happen on that time frame rather than a 20 or 30-year one.
Great, thank you. I've been waved at that we need to start drawing to a close. So we have one more thought from each of you, and it's good to end on a positive note. So, let's look ahead to 2030. Maybe share some thoughts about what should we expect between now and then, what are you most excited about, what are priorities, and so on. Angus, why don't you start this way?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I was coming in this morning, and many of you have probably got children, so I have 17, 15, and 13-year-old. And I was thinking, I really genuinely believe there is a possibility my 13-year-old will never own a house that is powered by gas power stations or has gas heating. And that's practically what I think we're talking, that's what we're talking about here is, and in that world, if we get to that world, his energy bill will be at least a third lower than it is today, possibly even 50% if you put the numbers together. And it's well in our sight. So we have to do the things we've just described, but I think that made it very real for me.
Thank you. Carl?
I think what I would say is, look, the imperative of moving to a cleaner energy and a domestic renewable, the upside of that is if we get it right, it's going to lead to enormous economic advantage and growth and jobs.
Fantastic. Chris?
I'd build off something that Angus said in his last comment there, which is that the way we'll do this is actually not about what government lays out in a plan, right? I mean, the challenge here is that collectively we need a whole industry to support this. And the point about the mission framing is just that. Like, if we all get focused on it, it becomes possible. If it is just government pushing, it's not possible. And what we've seen in the last year is that is exactly what happens. If you reframe your outlook on it, and know that others are trying to do the same thing, we move much, much, much faster. So we're going to be in a period over the next year, I would say, where you're going to see that happen. And I suppose my point, I make this point regularly when I speak, is we should celebrate it when it happens. We need to feel optimistic about it. There's been some dark stuff in the last few years for those who work on climate. This is a moment where I think we will be able to say that we're motoring on this, thanks to the work that Carl and his colleagues are doing. So I'm going to keep saying that because we need to remind ourselves that stuff is happening and that it's very positive. And that, in turn, drives more ambition. Go faster on this again. And I would love my kids to have exactly the same experience. My kids are not at all interested in what I do, so I can tell you that's what happens with kids. My son was far more interested in me breaking my arm the other day when he threw me a ball. I don't want them to have to think about any of this, if I'm honest with you. I think that's the key thing at the end of this, is that this is not, we can move on to other issues at that point. So let's get it done.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, with that, I think we should let you all go back to your day jobs where you're getting it done. So please join me in thanking our brilliant panel. Thank you.